So for the few of you who don't know, I'm Rob Tullis. I used to work here. And this is the fourth in a series of 4 lectures that I've been giving here on Friday mornings in August. I started the series talking about placemaking thought, the writers that are the foundation of placemaking concepts. My second talk was on placemaking form, the architectural solids and voids of the city and how they're composed to create place. Last week, my third talk was about activity and use in the public realm and how they help turn space into place. And today I'm going to talk about memory, emotion, and meaning in architectural design that defines small urban place and how they relate to that somewhat undefined phenomenon that we call sense of place. I'm assuming that probably everybody in this room has heard the term sense of place and heard it bandied about at various BRA presentations and things like that. Just show of hands, who here thinks that they could define what sense of place means? I'm not going to ask you to do so you can feel free to put your hand up. Very few. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, good. Couple. And how many of you here have heard of something known as situated cognition, or embodied cognition, or grounded cognition? One. Excellent. That's fabulous. So today I'm going to talk about memory, emotion, and meaning in architectural design. And it's somewhat of a tall order, as architects have been debating the importance of memory, emotion, and meaning in design for ages. I'll run through a brief history of this debate, and I'll finish with the recent brain research on the subject. And as I do, I believe that you'll see that the thinkers that I've previously mentioned in the first 3 lectures basically had it right, that their theories and instincts are now borne out by place-oriented neuroscience work that's come in. So let's review chronologically, jumping from century to century in an amazingly speedy and vastly condensed review. Ancient thought comes to us through Vitruvius, whose De Architectura is the only architectural text to survive into modern times. In an interesting precedent to modern linguistic analogies in architectural theory, Vitruvius relates his concept of memoria by borrowing terms from ancient writings on language, oratory, and rhetoric. In a 2012 paper, Harvard fellow Daniel Walden summarizes this by writing, quote, "In rhetoric, the speaker is urged to recollect elements of a speech by imagining walking through an architectural space in which the ideas are placed like statues in architectural niches. Vitruvius similarly describes the purpose of memorial statues ornamenting real architectural space as teachable moments for future generations," unquote. For Vitruvius and the ancients, it seems, the relationship between memory and architecture was twofold. First, that imagined architecture could serve as a scaffolding for mnemonic triggers that prompt people to recall events, and this evolved into the memory palace technique. And second, that real architecture's ability to store and evoke memories could be used to convey societal or cultural values. Both aspects are based on an important biological fact that was known to the ancients and has been more recently proven by all sorts of visual cognitive studies, that we are visually oriented social animals who are extremely good at remembering places we know. Remember that phenomenon, I'll return to it later. After all ancient written architectural works except Vitruvius were lost to the Dark Ages, Renaissance architects looked back to the ancient world for inspiration. In the age of humanism, the role of memory in architecture focused not just on the methodology for remembering facts in oratory, but on the second notion of the conveyance of cultural values. Leon Battista Alberti's Di Pectura in 1435 and his De Architectura in 1452, for example, combined practical and philosophical advice to emphasize the aesthetics of humanism. For Alberti, beauty and virtue are achieved via lineamenta, design that allows proportions to be perceived, and materia, images and crafts derived from nature. They combine to appeal to man through consinitas, which he defines as, quote, the spouse and soul of reason. Alberti says that architects act towards a moral end. The architect is to design beautiful buildings, and they contribute to the order of cities. The city's order makes visible its civics and justice and piety. I'm vastly oversimplifying, but for Alberti and the early Renaissance humanists, architecture conveys cultural content. A material thing, such as a building, or more importantly for us, a group of buildings defining an urban space, can make immaterial qualities visible. As an example of a public space conveying early Renaissance values of civics and justice and piety through order and reason, I show you Piazza Pio II in Pienza. It was designed by Alberti's student Bernardo Rossellino. Piazza Pio is likely the first realization of early Renaissance theories about the ideal city, and it's widely recognized as a statement of humanist ideas and meanings. It's basically the very first Renaissance piazza. Built between 1459 and 1462 for Pope Pius II, the 75 by 85 foot piazza is sited at a bend in the main street of his small Tuscan hometown. The resulting angles of the flanking buildings create a trapezoidal space which was exploited to set its cathedral apart, framing it with openings that look out over a beautiful valley, the Val d'Orcia. These gaps may be the first Renaissance example of opening views from a city center to the countryside, a departure from the typical enclosure of medieval piazzas. They were likely meant to cast the piazza as the embodiment of civilization in the midst of nature, a humanist concept of the resolution of opposites. The cathedral's facade consists of 3 bays and is divided by vertical pilasters and horizontal entablatures into a grid of squares. Just above its center is a circular window called the occhio, literally an eye. The Pope's home, Palazzo Piccolomini, takes an offset and subordinate position at the west side of the piazza. Its facade is an Alberti-like gridded composition. Palazzo Vescovile, the bishop's house on the east side of the piazza, is a rather plain medieval structure. Both flanking buildings are treated symmetrically with stone benches that run along their base. The public well sits at the west end of the edge of the piazza, and across the street, the city hall has a loggia that repeats the triple arches of the cathedral and a clock tower that mirrors the cathedral's campanile. But stylistically, there is more variety than commonality in the group. There are, however, reoccurring patterns of simple shapes and proportions, which visually link the buildings to one another and to the pavement. I show you an analysis drawing of squares in blue, rectangles with a 2:3 ratio in green, and circles or semicircles in red used in the facade. The piazza's pavement is a grid of travertine lines infilled with red brick in a herringbone pattern. This wasn't new to the Renaissance. We saw it at Siena's Piazza del Campo. Here, however, the grid aligns with the corners, centers, pilasters, and door frames of all of the buildings on the piazza, including those across the street, and it pulls the whole composition together. The 9 rectangles at the center of the pavement have 2:3 proportions, like those in the facade of the church, but they can be read as squares when they're seen from the street, making the piazza seem deeper than it is. Trapezoids are also edged in travertine where they meet the flanking buildings, except interestingly at the Piccolomini doorway, which you see there, emphasizing the piazza's shape and its relationship to the angled streets. An echo between the cathedral's occhio and a ring in the pavement's center reinforces the reflection of the 9-module grid from church facade to ground plane. The horizontal distance from the church door to the ring is the same as the vertical height to its occhio, and the circles have the same diameter. This reinforces an imperfect bilateral symmetry across the plaza's north-south axis, and it implies what's really a non-existent symmetry across its east-west axis. Now here's an interesting fact that I think demonstrates the Renaissance's effort to evoke memory and to convey meaning. The shadow cast by the cathedral exactly aligns with the grid of the pavement 11 days after the solar equinox. Apparently, the Julian calendar in the 15th century was 11 days out of sync with the solar cycle, and both Rossellino and the Pope would have been well aware of this. The Gregorian calendar had been proposed, but it was controversial in the Catholic Church since the spring equinox determined the date of Easter Sunday. There's a researcher named Jan Piper who in 1986 published research saying that he believes that the cathedral was originally designed to cast this shadow on the scientific equinox, March 10th, and that its height was revised so that the shadow alignment would occur on the dogmatically defined March 21st, perhaps because the cardinals had failed to adopt the proposed calendar change. The buildings were all under construction at the time, and a change in the pavement grid would have put it out of alignment. The only solution, according to Piper's theory, was to add height to the cathedral. He believes that the entire roof was raised approximately 7 feet to give the correct height to the facade, and his evidence to support this theory includes unusual 7-foot extensions topping the pillars inside the cathedral and the absence of an Albertian proportional system in the facade. This phenomenological shadow alignment was that important in the creation of the first Renaissance ideal city, and the piazza was meant to convey cultural meaning, to be the civilizing setting for a civic society and the theater for human and humanist events. The late 17th and 18th centuries ushered in the Age of Enlightenment, an intellectual movement emphasizing reason rather than tradition. The new scientific definition of knowledge permeated art and architecture and culture. Rather than abstract musings about the philosophical framework of the universe, according to Enlightenment scholars, man was ruled by natural law. Intellectual memory and human emotion was still deemed to play a role in the production of architectural meaning, but there was a growing emphasis on empiricism and the role of the physical senses. Examples include Logier's primitive hut theories about the anthropological relationship between man and his environment, that the essentials of architecture were derived from man's need for shelter and enclosure, and the evolution from Brunelleschi's Renaissance rediscovery of the rules of perspective to Piranesi's explorations of fictitious environments that inspired awe, depictions of a human experience of place known as the sublime. In the 19th century, study in the now mature academies brought on an interest in non-classical styles that were thought to be appropriate for use in buildings of certain types or to evoke certain cultural associations. This is the Style Wars period, the interlude of Romanticism. The 19th century thought about memory, emotion, and meaning in architecture may be represented by John Ruskin's 1849 book, The Seven Lamps of Architecture. The lamps of the title are Ruskin's design principles. The sixth was called the Lamp of Memory. In this chapter, Ruskin wrote about the role of memory and the role that memory and meaning play in architecture. Quote, "The greatest glory of a building is not in its stones, not in its gold. Its glory is in its age and in that deep sense of voicefulness and mysterious sympathy which we feel in walls that have long been washed by the passing waves of humanity. It is in their lasting witness, in their quiet contrast with the transitional character of all things, that we are to look for the real light and color and preciousness of architecture." This is flowery writing that essentially means that architecture, because it's more permanent by nature than many of man's endeavors, should embody the culture from which it has developed and gains the power to communicate that culture through its use over time by man. And Ruskin's use of the words, the sense of voicefulness, of mysterious sympathy, I would argue is a 19th century attempt to talk about sense of place. At the end of the 19th century, the age of industry produced a schism in which an emphasis on engineering and the architecture of the machine became used for utilitarian buildings, or parts of buildings, and the more memory, emotion, and meaning-evoking traditional or academic styles were deemed appropriate for cultural buildings or the cultural parts of buildings. The best example of this schism is the 19th century train station, with its historicist waiting room or hotel housing people at the front and facing the square, and its cast iron train shed housing machines at the rear. All of this evolution of thought about the role of memory, emotion, and meaning in architecture was radically changed in Europe after the end of World War I, and in America by the end of World War II, by people who found themselves inspired by, I would say, the wrong end of the train station, if you will. Le Corbusier offers an interesting example. Corb brings in the element of time in a different way than Ruskin. No longer is memory or emotion related to our personal or cultural experience and absorption of symbols and forms over time. Instead, what's important is the movement of the human body through space over time, architectural procession. In a paper entitled Le Corbusier's Kaleidoscope, Looking at the Architect's Sense of Place, Adam Kleinman writes, quote, "In his youth, Le Corbusier slowly walked through the Acropolis to watch how his changing views of the Parthenon began to create not a stone temple, but a mental composite, which activated in his imagination as much as it did in his eyes. Key among these vistas was how the building was revealed or concealed with each step, so that a kind of time travel could be felt. By taking in the view from various coordinates and superimposing such differing perceptions of the same object, he was able to project himself back to various points in time and sensation. In an essay on Le Corbusier's work, Colin Rowe proposed that such a layering of space, time, and memory could be called phenomenological transparency. At Corb's Villa Savoy, for instance, the pure cube is hollowed out and cut through so that one can view one room from another, like a scene in a strategically placed frame. When one moves about, the perception of each room is now one in a series of multiple impressions. Similarly, Corb weaves two vertical travel paths through the house. The spiral stair is clockwise, curvilinear, and incremental. The ramp is counterclockwise, rectilinear, and continuous. They come together at 90 degrees at the full landing of the ramp and the mid-level of the stair. This scenographic presentation of forms brings time and memory into play as narrative through foreshadowing, flashback, juxtaposition, and the like. The notion of narrative is important, as we'll soon see. Unfortunately, Corb's foray into urban planning was not as sophisticated as his architecture. Modernism is advocated by the CM in the 1920s and 30s, and more specifically, modern urban design, as advocated in Corb's 1943 Athens Charter, proposed that a utopian, functionalist, and non-referential city should emerge from the post-war rubble. In 1941, Siegfried Gideon published the influential book Space, Time, and Architecture. Gideon's premise was that the Industrial Revolution had caused a separation to occur between thinking and feeling, exemplified by what he considered the derivative 19th century architecture of the front of the train shed, and that the modern movement must reunite them with a scientific approach and by adding the dimension of time to its three-dimensional depiction of space. Relative to urbanism, Gideon praised Corb's separating of people from cars in different traffic tracks, separating them from the ground in slab-like high-rises, and separating uses in the city with functionalist zoning. Considering that at the time of his final revision to the book in 1962, Pruitt-Igoe was already a failure in St. Louis, it was later dynamited in a moment dubbed The Death of Modernism by Charles Jenks, and that Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities was influencing city planning by advocating just the opposite, Gideon seems badly dated today. He did, however, inspire a second generation of modernists. As I discussed in Lecture 1, because Corb's and Gideon's urban utopia had failed to materialize by the 1960s, despite the great changes that modernism, transportation engineering, and functionalist zoning had made on city design and city spaces, some architects in the 1960s and 70s started to re-examine and re-embrace earlier thought. Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck, for instance, in emphasizing human interaction in what seems to be a reassessment of Gideon, wrote, quote, "Whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. For space in the image of man is place, and time in the image of man is occasion." So who was it that was looking for some Venturi a couple of lectures ago? There you are. In the influential Learning from Las Vegas, published in 1972, Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Stephen Eisenhower write, quote, "This second generation of modern architects acknowledge only the constituent facts of history as extracted by Siegfried Gideon, who abstracted the historical building and its piazza as pure form and space in light. These architects' preoccupation with space as the architectural quality caused them to read the buildings as forms, the piazzas as space, and the graphics and sculpture as color, texture, and scale. The ensemble became an abstract expression in architecture. But the competition of signs and symbols in the medieval city at various levels of perception and meaning in both building and piazza was lost on the space-oriented architect," unquote. And I would say lost on the free space-oriented architect. Learning from Las Vegas urged architects to recognize the associations and references that architecture carries and the memory and meaning conveyed by their cultural symbols. Their 1977 revised edition was subtitled "The Forgotten Symbolism of Architectural Form," so that, in the words of its authors, its theories would, quote, "appear more clearly what we intended them to be, a treatise on the symbolism in architecture," unquote. Remember that the development of meanings associated with human interaction over time was important to the three 1970s theorists from my first lecture. In 1977's A Pattern Language, Chris Alexander said that his 253 interrelated spatial patterns each, quote, "has a pattern of events associated with it, and that the total pattern, space and event together, is an element of people's culture, unquote. In 1978's Collage City, Colin Rowe and Fred Coder suggested bricolage as a technique and wrote of the bricoleur, quote, creating structures by means of events, unquote. And in The Architecture of the City, Aldo Rossi maintained that a city must be understood as something constructed by man over time, and that its permanences are distinguished as places of symbolic function. For Rossi, collective memory is associated with these objects and places, and therefore the built city becomes a theater of human events. You will recall that all of this translated into what Rossi called the locus solus, or specific place. And you will recall its similarity to the Roman concept of genus loci, or spirit of the place. Again, what today we might call sense of place. Others at the time focused on kinesthetics, the role of the human body in our five senses, in relationship to place-oriented architecture. In their 1977 book, Body, Memory, and Architecture, Charles Moore and Kent Bloomer referred to, quote, a feeling of being bounded, possessed, and centered, unquote, by buildings, and say that it, quote, must apply to the city as well if the city is to belong to its constituency, unquote. Bloomer and Moore talk about the building as a partner in dialogue, writing, quote, we might simply ask what the building tells us about the place of our bodies within and around it. This may have as much to do with static fit, where do we sit, lean, nestle, as with dynamic fit, where and how do we move, unquote. They offer the example of Richard Upjohn's Connecticut State Capitol as a building that provides many opportunities for human-place dialogue with its niches, bays, stairs, portals, and even its stone carvings of graceful figures. They contrast this with places where the body is, quote, victim of the opposite excess, becoming unhinged, free-floating, and alienated in architectural space. They cite Mies van der Rohe's 1942 Museum for a Small City drawings, where the figures, quote, stand free and solitary in a neutral, gridded Cartesian space, and they say it is indeed a lonely existence, unquote. Bloomer and Moore refer to a 1966 book titled The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, in which J.J. Gibson focused on how our senses process environmental information. Gibson maintains that senses are not just receptors, but that they project out to gather experience. They are aggressive, information-seeking mechanisms. This is critically important to their role in a person-place dialogue. He accepts Aristotle's sight and hearing categories of senses. He combines smell and taste together, and he splits the sense of touch into two, an orienting system and a haptic system, haptic meaning touch. In Gibson's orienting system, we gather information to make distinctions about up versus down, front versus back, order versus randomness. These relate to gravity and the ground plane, to our body posture, to our position relative to three-dimensional objects. In his haptic system, our sense of touch is reconsidered to include the entire body rather than just our hands. Treated as a perceptual system, it incorporates all sensations gathered through touch, including pressure, warmth, cold, pain, and even movement. The 1970s and 80s saw an explosion in research and scholarship on these issues. This work was being done by people in 5 disciplines. 1, landscape, 2, sociology, 3, anthropology, 4, environmental psychology, and 5, something known as cultural geography. They wrote about a topic that they variously called place dialogue, place attachment, place identity, and even tropophilia, defined as the effective bond between people in a particular place. In 1981, environmental psychologist Fritz Steele wrote a book titled The Sense of Place, and that term seems to have been firmly in the lexicon by 1994, when well-known landscape scholar J.B. Jackson wrote Sense of Place, Sense of Time. There's a good book called Public Places, Urban Spaces that in textbook-like fashion provides an exposition of various approaches to urban design. It's on my bibliography, as are most of the books that I mentioned here. In their section on the perceptual dimension of urban design, the authors write, quote, the period since the 1970s has seen increasing interest in examination of people's ties to and conceptions of places. This is often drawn on phenomenology, which aims to describe and understand phenomena as experience, wherein human consciousness takes in information and makes it into the world. Thus, while meanings of places are rooted in their physical setting and activities, they are not a property of them, but rather of human intentions and experiences. Hence, what the environment represents is a function of our own subjective construction of it, unquote. The authors cite Edward Ralph's Place and Placelessness, written in 1976, as one of the earliest works drawing on phenomenology and focused on the psychological and experiential sense of place. Ralph, a geographer, argued that, quote, however amorphous and intangible, whenever we feel we know space, it is typically associated with a concept of place, unquote. For Ralph, they say, Kevin Lynch's image of the city definition of individuality of place merely acknowledges that each place has a unique address without explaining how it becomes identifiable. Ralph argues that physical setting, activities, and meanings constitute the three basic elements of the identity of places. Since a place doesn't reside in those three elements, but in the human interaction with those elements, unquote. His assertion is remarkably similar to this Venn diagram, a composite of those by John Punter in 1991 and John Montgomery in 1998. They maintain that place is created when form, activity, and meaning combine. This is the three-legged stool that I've referred to throughout my talks. But I'm not sure that this diagram necessarily explains how the three combine to turn space into place. What's the process of creating a sense of place? So a year or more before I knew anything about the brain research that I'll conclude with today, I altered it a bit to help document my speculations. It seemed to me that a sense of place isn't inherent in form, the physical setting of a public space, and not in use, the activities that people engage in there, but is tied to our perception and conception of them, then the human mind has a major role to play. People bring something to the space, and if the space offers them something in return, I think there's an emotional transaction that occurs to invest the space with significance, and that this transaction is tied to our formation of image and meaning. I was pleased to find that this notion of emotional transaction was in line with the writings of Yi-Fu Tan, another geographer and contemporary of Ralph's. In his 1977 book, Space and Place, Tan says that a place comes into existence when humans give meaning to a specific part of a larger, undifferentiated space. J.B. Jackson, in 1994's Sense of Place, Sense of Time, says, quote, a sense of place is something that we ourselves create in the course of time. It is the result of habit or custom. A sense of place is reinforced by what might be called a sense of reoccurring events, unquote. Artist Alan Gussow certainly refers to an emotional transaction when he writes, quote, but as humans, we also require support for our spirits, and this is what certain kinds of places provide. The catalyst that converts any physical location, any environment, if you will, into a place is the process of experiencing deeply. A place is a piece of the whole environment that has been claimed by feelings, unquote. And the architect Donald Linden, who founded a magazine called Places Journal in the early 1980s, emphasized it when he wrote, quote, it is not the designer who creates a sense of place. It is the user or observer. The designer merely sets out opportunities for others to use, to make distinctions, to perceive connections, and to take advantage, or not, of the structure of thought that is there, unquote. Leave it to the architect in this group to hint at something helpful for placemakers when he says the designer, quote, sets out opportunities, unquote. Remember that for later, too. So the geographers, landscapers, sociologists, anthropologists, environmental psychologists, and even a few architects are all trying to describe something that they know exists, but they can't quite nail it down. They can demonstrate it through empiricism, but they can't quite document how it works. Like Chris Alexander's Quality Without a Name, it's a bit elusive. Then we get the first inklings of what I think is a game changer. In 1990, Tony Hiss, a New Yorker staff member and author of 5 previous books, who had become a researcher and lecturer in the evolving science of place, wrote a book titled The Experience of Place. It's interesting to read it today, as the cognitive science that he refers to, and which I'll delve into in a moment, I promise, was just emerging at that time. Hiss develops a theory of what he calls simultaneous perception, which he writes is, quote, a part of the structure of our attention, a mechanism that drinks in whatever it can from our surroundings, unquote. He writes about walking through the main concourse of Grand Central Station and being simultaneously aware of all of the various stimuli, the movement of people, the smells from the adjacent food shops, the sound of the train announcements, the sun streaming in through the windows, and the thoughts in his own head. He marvels at, quote, how much of their ordinary environments people respond to, and that people have within them, excuse me, various brain-body mechanisms that react to different aspects of their surroundings, unquote, in simultaneously conscious and unconscious ways. This refers to Holly White, Chris Alexander, Kevin Lynch, Jay Appleton, and the Project for Public Spaces as he tries to develop his thoughts about what makes people react consciously and unconsciously to the places where we live and work in ways we scarcely notice or are only now becoming known to us, and why it's important to learn our ordinary surroundings, built and natural alike, have immediate and continuing effect on the way we feel and act and on our health and intelligence. Those are quotes from the book. He cites various psychology experiments that show subjects behave more passively after time spent in a painted pink room. And by the way, certain NFL teams paint their visitor locker rooms what's called passive pink in an effort to calm their opponents down before game time. That they express a preference for photos of environments with grass and water, that they express a preference for landscapes with a sense of mystery, quote, giving the impression that one could acquire new information if one were to travel deeper into the scene, unquote, and legibility, quote, that look as if one could travel extensively without getting lost, unquote, and that rats' brains grow faster when they are raised in enriched environments, and one of my favorites, the beautiful room experiment. In this experiment, volunteers were told that they were studying photographs of people to see whether the faces displayed energy and well-being. They made these assessments in an ugly room that resembled a janitor's closet, an average room that resembled an office, and a beautiful room with tall ceilings, large windows, Navajo rugs, artwork, and sculpture. The results showed that both the subjects and their supervisors, who were also kept in the dark, found energy and well-being in faces when they looked at them in the beautiful room, and found fatigue and sickness in the exact same faces when they were viewed in the ugly room. Interestingly, the results in the average room more closely resembled those in the ugly room, showing that even an average room is a diminished environment. Hiss attributes simultaneous perception to Homo sapiens' prehistoric evolution on the East African plains when, quote, our remote ancestors came down from the treetops and moved out onto the warmth and openness of the savanna. There on the grasslands, over the course of many thousands of generations, they acquired larger brains and learned to stand and walk upright, to fashion tools and containers, and to live and work together cooperatively. He also writes, quote, sight has been our most important sense ever since our hominid ancestors stood upright away from the abundance of sense on the ground and found that they could see for long distances. Many of the perceptions of ordinary consciousness evolved in this visually dominant world, unquote. He quotes a Smithsonian scientist as stating that walking upright and freeing our hands for carrying and using tools suggests that, quote, habitat preference may be tied to our basic anatomy, unquote. Hiss quotes a California research psychiatrist's identification of a fluid body boundary, the border at which we divide our attention equally between ourselves and the things outside ourselves. Hiss writes that, quote, through one system of perception, we see ourselves as observers of an environment composed of separate objects, but at the same time, through another system of perception, equally active, we look for ways in which we are connected to or are a part of our surroundings, unquote. Hiss is struggling a bit to pull all of this evidence together in 1990, but his instincts are correct. Because, wham, like a trickle of water building up to overflow a dam, at the dawn of the new millennium, the age of biology that we are now in, all the musings from Vitruvius through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and modernism and the 1970s reassessment were pushed over the top by the growing amount of brain research to come flooding into our architectural world. This brain research and its associated technology revealed scientifically that the previous thought, instincts, observations, theory, and even what we would today call evidence-based design that I've been lecturing about over the past 3 Friday mornings was essentially correct. In a paper called Neuroscience, Memory, and Social Manipulation, Harvard professor Daniel L. Schachter writes about memory formation and the experience of place. Quote, we now know enough about how memories are stored and retrieved to demolish another long-standing myth that memories are passive or literal recordings of reality. We do not store judgment-free snapshots of our past experiences, but rather hold on to the meaning, sense, and emotions that these experiences provided us, unquote. And in what I believe is a paradigm shift for architects and city designers, what has now emerged is the concept of situated cognition. So in a book published just this past spring, just a couple of months ago, called Welcome to Your World, How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives, Sarah Williams Golhagen writes that situated cognition, sometimes it's also called embodied cognition or grounded cognition. They're slightly different, but they're basically the same. Quote, holds that much of what and how people think is a function of our living in the kinds of bodies we do and in the environments we do. It reveals much more than we previously knew, of humans' thought is neither logical nor linear, but associative and non-conscious. What the new paradigm of embodied or situated cognition reveals is that the built environment and its design matters far, far more than anybody, even architects, ever thought that it did, unquote. Golhagen defines cognitions as the many processes by which people understand, interpret, and organize sensory, social, and internally generated data for their own use, or basically incidences of the human thought process, for short. By situated, or embodied, or grounded, the science means that we are situated in 1, our body, 2, the natural world, and 3, the social world. Cognitions are the product of a three-way collaboration of mind, body, and environment. Golhagen writes, quote, cognitions do not emerge in tension with the corporeal self, as was thought for centuries, nor from a disembodied mind. Instead, the brain and the body together facilitate the operations of the human mind, which depends on their architecture for its very existence and for its modes of functioning. Human cognition takes place in the corporeal body that lives on the earth and in space, unquote. Apparently, there was widespread skepticism about situated cognition as recently as 1998, but it's increasingly finding confirmation in neuroscience. Golhagen suggests that we need to reframe the way we think about architecture. Just as our relationship to nature was once thought about as our presence in individual settings, prairies, mountains, rivers, the seashore, etc. In the late 1960s, they all evolved into the environment, as we became knowledgeable and concerned about their interrelationship and man's effect on it. Similarly, she says, individual constructed settings, bridges, buildings, streets, infrastructure, and our professions that design them should now be thought of as the built environment because our mind-body cognitions treat them as all interrelated. Our cognitions apparently exist along a range from conscious to non-conscious, and along a range from pre-verbal to verbal to non-verbal. As Freud once said, quote, the mind is like an iceberg, it floats with only 1/7 of its bulk above water, unquote. Golhagen says 90% of our brain processes are non-conscious, meaning beyond our conscious awareness. We don't know they're going on, they just go. The mind is functioning on input that we gain from our bodies and our environments, and it acts on it without conscious thought. And that's another interesting point. Our cognitions aren't only multisensory, they're multimodal, meaning that sensory perception is always preparation for action. Our motor neurons and our capacity for narrative are also involved. So I look out a door or a window, and I think about how it opens and how I might open it and move through it. It's just part of the process. Sight also activates haptic parts of the brain, so I don't need to actually touch surfaces to have them activate my tactile sense brain cells. Therefore, surfaces, textures, and colors are really important because all I need to do is look at them and I imagine what it would be like to touch them. We also incorporate schemas and metaphors into our cognitions. Schemas are patterns of associations. You open the refrigerator door and find no milk for your morning coffee. Instantly, without consciously thinking about it, you are imagining a trip to the grocery store and picturing the milk aisle and reaching into the cold case there because your mind-body knows that's how you get more milk. Metaphorical schemas are those which transport one kind of content or meaning to another, like when Saarinen used swoopy bird shapes to evoke flight in designing the TWA terminal, or PTW architects and Arab engineers used the image of bubbles to clad the water-cube Olympic pool in Beijing. It's also how buildings get nicknames, like the Beijing Olympic Stadium being known as the Bird's Nest. Schemas and metaphors aid us in what's called gist extraction, our ability to rapidly download only the features of a new pool of information that's of use to us in the task at hand. And scientists can now explain the relationship of memory to place. Memories are consolidated or prepared for long-term storage in an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which also works with other parts of the brain, place cells, to facilitate our navigation of spaces. So in forming memories, the brain uses those very same place cells, encoding the memory along with the data about where it happened. So that discussion that you had with your mother about the person you decided to marry is encoded with metadata about where the conversation took place on her front steps in the fall. Amazingly, the uncoding also works in reverse, so that seeing those front steps covered in fall leaves reminds you of that conversation. There are related grid cells that work with place cells to facilitate navigation. These allow us to continually update our sense of position relative to the objects around us and to an imagined coordinate system. This is sometimes referred to as dead reckoning. It's been around since the pirates. But apparently, the grid cells reference a hexagonal latticework of points, not a Cartesian grid. This may explain some of Frank Lloyd Wright's plans, and is probably due to the forward orientation of our eyes and feet and the degree of swivel of our necks, because it's all about 30 and 60-degree angles, not 90-degree angles, unless you're an owl. The mind's constant reference to experience perceived through our body also explains how we know forward from backward, up from down, and how we account for gravity in all perceptions and cognitions. There's more, and it's all fascinating, but I'll move on. Golhagen, like Hiss and others, cites fun facts to know and tell. Miscellaneous experiments and studies that reveal things like people think more creatively and respond better to abstract concepts when they're seated in rooms with high ceilings, or in rooms where ceilings are painted sky blue. Humans respond to sharp, irregular angled forms with discomfort and even muffled fear. People in red rooms are exposed to red light, suffer diminished problem-solving skills, and reduced capacity to engage in social conversation. She shakes her head at John Nouvel's 2010 Serpentine Pavilion in London's Hyde Park, writing, quote, "Nouvel's pavilion looks terrific in photographs, but I doubt that people who visited lingered there to play on its blood-red, oversized chessboard, and I can nearly guarantee that fewer still experience the happy warmth and delight that Nouvel aspired to elicit. That is because his three most significant design decisions, sharp angles, diagonally canted walls and ceilings, and the large-scale use of the color red, including red-tinted glass for the windows, were guaranteed to undermine rather than advance his intentions. Instead of, quote, happy sensations, unquote, it's far likelier that visitors felt an uneasy sense of stress and even anxiety." I remember in my studio here, when we'd be rendering up retail environments, David Manfredi would stride through and look at all the grays that we were coloring, and he'd go, "Happy colors, happy colors." She also refers to another problem that both she and I agree on, that often contemporary starchitects seem focused on a single iconic photo view that will play well in the media, on the cover of the Rolling Stone, as architect Michael Dennis derisively says, rather than focusing on a sense of place or human habitation. She anonymously quotes one highly respected contemporary architect, who she won't name, as saying, "It's all about the money shot. That's what we designed for." Golhagen laments that, quote, "designers simply lack sufficient knowledge about human environmental experience. This stems in part from the anachronisms of an architectural education. Very few schools of design, with rare exceptions, offer, much less require, training on how humans experience the built environment. Unusual forms and statement architecture reinforce the budding designer's impression that their projects are singular, discrete objects, isolated from their environmental and urban context, and not immediately tethered to how actual people will experience and use them," unquote. Her message for us is clear when she writes, quote, "The aesthetics of a new project, how it is composed, how the people who use it will experience it, how it is designed, is too often dismissed as unknowable or irrelevant. The question of how its design affects human beings is rarely asked. Good design, thoughtfully composed ordering systems and patterns, sensuously active materials and textures, deliberately constructed sequences of spaces, create coherent places that have a powerfully positive effect on people. Urban spaces, landscapes, and buildings profoundly influence our well-being. They actually help constitute the very sense of ourselves, our sense of identity. So I am positing here that this operation of situated cognition is, when it produces emotional nourishment, what we mean by sense of place. It's not just a marketing slogan for the latest live, work, play, mixed-use project, although I'm as guilty as anybody of using it that way. But rather, it's a biological, mental, emotional fact of our evolved life in a human body on the earth. And for the placemaking focus of these talks, our life in defined urban spaces. It's the emotional transaction that my instincts told me it was, and the mechanism of the transformation from space into place that I talked about in the first minute of lecture number 1 when I showed you this diagram. So sense of place in the age of neuroscience is our conscious and unconscious emotional reaction to our body-mind's kinesthetic and cognitive experience in and in relationship to our immediate surroundings. The work of other researchers also validates this. Mathematician Nikos Salingaros contends that evolutionary traits make us information processing machines. We're compelled to constantly scan our environment and engage with it as an informational field. Since spatial information plays a fundamental role in human functionality, we require it in order to sustain us. The feedback we get fulfills a need for emotional nourishment, or in the case of poorly or naively designed spaces, it does not. Jodan Roth, an architect and urban designer, has conducted experiments in which people map their feelings within urban environments. The feeling maps show a high degree of agreement on which spaces feel good and which feel bad. Agreements span age, resident, non-resident, layperson, design professional, and socioeconomic characteristics. Colin Ellard, a neuroscientist and author of a book called Places of the Heart, has people walk undifferentiated and bland street fronts versus complex and active street fronts. They answer questions that attempt to assess their emotional state, and they wear bracelets that measure skin conductance, a measure of alertness. He also observes their body posture. In front of blank facades, his subjects are quiet, stooped, and passive. At more fractal and visually complex sites, they are animated and chatty. Skin conductance measures of arousal are higher. Ellard concludes that humans are, quote, biologically disposed to favor locations defined by complexity, interest, and the passing of messages of one kind or another, unquote. Some useful specifics for placemakers come from the 2015 book, Cognitive Architecture by Anne Sussman and Sussman Hollander. They're local here in Boston. Anne was going to attend today, but she had to drop a kid off at a train station to go to college. In it, they reference the brain research in cognitive science that proves, quote, people have multiple subconscious tendencies and behaviors that govern their responses to built environments, unquote, and that these behaviors are bred into the way our brain works after millennia of evolution in which we've evolved to walk upright and free our hands for work, and become visually oriented social creatures with modified brain size, configuration, and circuitry. Designers who take this hard wiring into account can predict our reactions as a species to certain types and features of city space. Sussman and Hollander identify 4 main tendencies. 1, that edges matter. Research shows that humans and other mammals, reptiles, insects, and even bacteria dropped into a petri dish are thigmotactic, or edge huggers. Well-defined street corridors or exterior places innately appeal to us and promote certain responses, including a tendency to physically and emotionally engage with spaces. By contrast, we instinctively go on defensive alert when edge conditions are poorly defined. 2, that patterns matter, particularly face patterns, on actual people we meet and in faces that we perceive in everything from the arrangement of windows on building facades, Jesus and burnt toast, and Ho Chi Minh and the blue stripe on the Boston gas tanks. We have evolved to prioritize sight above all other senses, and our brains devote more area to face recognition than to any other visual object. We therefore feel most comfortable in spaces of a size in which we can access, assess, and read faces quickly. Sussman and Hollander subscribe to John Geale's 100-meter and 25-meter thresholds. Because of our constant scanning for faces and because of our body's experience in gravity, Nature has preset our preference for up-down vertical orientation. Humans therefore tend to organize visual input relative to vertical lines. That's an important point for you guys to all understand. Humans tend to organize visual input relative to vertical lines, and we tend to like shapes with left-right bilateral symmetry. 3, that shapes carry weight. Because of our field of vision, it takes approximately the same time and effort for us to scan 12 inches up-down as it does a bit over 18 inches left-right. We therefore are predisposed to favor shapes with golden section and root 2 rectangular proportions. Who knew? Because of our anthropomorphic, well, I knew the Renaissance architects knew. Because of our anthropomorphic scanning tendencies, we also innately favor curves and soft forms over sharp and angular forms, and we feel a sense of calm in response to fractal or hierarchical patterns of medium density that relate to our innate appreciation of natural form. And 4, that narrative matters. Storytelling is key. No other creature has the capacity to create and elaborate on its own story. And brain research has shown that narrative, the distinctly human ability to create stories from form, is one way we link to our environment and secure a place in it. The narrative aspects of moving from path to portal to place resonate, and place cues that allow us to imagine our role in its social activity engage emotional responses that help us orient ourselves, make attachments, and derive meaning from our physical surroundings. Their example here is the Villa Lante garden in Bagnia, Italy. It's a downhill linear progression that tells the story of man's biblical fall from grace and reemergence into a world of rationality and hope. But you'll see other examples of a more simplified narrative in a second. Anne Sussman notes that clever marketers have recognized some of these human traits for quite a while, and she laments that most architects have not. The guys at Amazon, for instance, know that the most clicked on part of an online image is the human face. The second, by the way, is pet's face. The image on the lower left uses eye tracking software to record the micro movements of a viewer's eye when looking at an image. Red is hot, green is not. And as the image at the top shows, the guys at Apple are not shy about using these traits against us in their store displays. Recently, Sussman has been conducting experiments herself. In her talks around the country, she shows images like this to her audiences and asks them to quickly choose which scene they'd rather be in. As she writes on her blog site called geneticsofdesign.com, the response rates are overwhelming. Everyone picks the Rue de Rivoli arcade on the right. No one selects the Coleman and McKinnell Brook Courthouse. Asked to pick which street they'd rather walk down, everyone chooses the Ontario street on the right. Nobody selects the Brooklyn street on the left. No big surprise, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. When she eye tracks these, the results show that the eye lingers on the facades of the Ontario street, assessing it as one of Salingeros's information fields, searching for and getting positive cognitive feedback. But the eye washes right over the horizontal and relatively featureless Brooklyn facade, searching in vain for some information at the scene's vanishing point. Sussman says, quote, "The results suggest one reason that the Brooklyn streetscape isn't favored is that our unconscious brain won't let us look at it. And that's huge," she says, because unconscious brain activity always lays the foundation for conscious behavior. We can't move towards a place, either physically or forming emotional attachments to it, that our pre-attentive processing has determined is to be ignored, unquote. Okay, one more for fun. Recently, Dwell magazine published an article called 10 Homes with Distinctive Facades, writing, quote, "It's their unique facades that make a memorable impression," unquote. Oh yeah? And I tracked this image and used the software's predictive ability to show a 98 predictability. The eye would focus on the person walking by the facade, 70 to 80% on the areas of contrast at its edges, 98% on the window. You can almost hear the brain saying, "Thank God, a window." And near 0% of focus on what the architects probably thought was the most appealing and innovative feature of their design. Remember my skepticism about public artwork that relies on text from Lecture 3. This house, the Hello House in Melbourne, Australia by Oof Architecture, actually doesn't make a memorable impression at all because it provides no scaffolding on which the mind is predisposed to form memories. Oof, indeed. So, how can we as designers actually help? Let's briefly examine situated cognition, the mind-body environmental paradigm, or what I am claiming is the operation of sense of place in situ, looking for techniques that we can use as designers to give it the best chance to flourish. I'll show many slides that I've shown in the past 3 lectures, but in a new context. Before, when we looked at these images, we focused on the who, what, where, and when of their use. Now we're focusing on the why. I hope this will be a nice coda pulling together and wrapping up all 4 talks. I'll break our strategies into a few categories: place legibility, place dialogue, and sensory interaction. Although because the neuroscience indicates that our cognitive process is so intertwined, I'm not sure they really matter. So first to the prerequisite, place legibility. This returns us to that important psychological fact that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. We are extremely good at remembering places we know. If places are well defined physically, they offer a firm scaffolding for place dialogue and therefore the formation of memories and meanings, and therefore place attachment, which I think equals sense of place. Remember that Kevin Lynch's image of the city research on place legibility established 5 physical features: paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks that figured strongly in people's memory, orientation, navigation, and place identification process. Golhagen notes that Kevin Lynch's findings on human perception have largely been confirmed by the brain research. She tells us that a group of cognitive neuroscientists further specified Lynch's edge path node observations and earned a Nobel Prize when they identified specific place recognition cells which work together with the grid cells in the brain in an integrated system. So, as an example of path identity, of how path identity can be applied to a specific place, think of the way Charles Moore arranged the buildings at Kresge College. As an example of edge definition with a linear boundary, think of the Stoa at the Agora in ancient Athens. For district as an area with a recognizable common characteristic, think of the intensity of the Spanish Quarter in Naples, Italy. As an example of node, think of the convergence of streets and the concentration of illuminated signs in New York City's Times Square. And for landmark, there's no better example of a reference point than the Campanile at Piazza San Marco, especially when my wife and 2 kids are standing in front of it. If our legible space is also to have high-quality spatial characteristics that people relate to and feel comfortable in, planning principles like those identified by Camillo Sitta, Gordon Cullen, and Ed Bacon kick in. Principles like the integration of building and plaza, represented here by the harmonious Piazza della Santissima Annunziata, enclosure, as represented by the continuous liner around Place de Vosges, differential proportion, as shown in the path portal place contrast at Piazza della Signoria and the Uffizi, and shape, distinctively demonstrated by Siena's Piazza del Campo. Or the grouping of linked spaces as found in medieval cities and the relationship of their experiential sequence as advocated by Gordon Cullen. These spatial characteristics tend to produce a place of security and comfort, and therefore a place of stasis, a place to linger. And this in turn allows the occupants to form a feeling of belonging to the environment instead of just passing through. Or of William MacDonald's identification of the armature as a device that marks place and tells where things are. Point elements like statues, towers, and clocks and other totems, as Camillo Sitt advocated, near but not on the center of a space. Arcades, usually along the perimeter, but sometimes freestanding elements that define distinct and usually more significant pathways. Gates and other threshold elements to define portals and allow people to perceive their position relative to entry, exit, and spatial transition. And elements that serve as way stations or intermediate goals, to break a pedestrian journey through the space into digestible segments. That brings me to my second functional aspect, place dialogue. Place theorists refer to the feeling of being bounded, centered, and possessed in such places as rootedness. And they speculate that it's an innate human need, that it anchors our sense of identity. For Edward Ralph, rootedness meant, quote, a secure place from which to look out on the world, a firm grasp of one's own position in the order of things, a significant spiritual and psychological attachment to somewhere in particular, unquote. For J. Appleton, it was the prospect and refuge, the satisfaction of two innate human needs whose recognition gives us the ability to predict, and I would argue to provide, enduring place aesthetics, all now supported by neuroscience. Both Holly White and John Gale documented ways that the human being is physically in dialogue with urban public space. White showed us that people engage in that dialogue in ways we might not expect, by placing themselves right in the middle of the action, sitting near travel paths, and even on the steps of entrances, anywhere where the architect has provided facilities that meet their predispositions, and always where they can scan for faces. Jan Gale pointed out that people also attach themselves to the edges of places, especially when they are soft edges, full of nooks and crannies. He documented the wide variety of activities that take place along soft edges. Gale also attributed this activity to a human predisposition, the biological trait we now know as stigmotaxis. Throughout these talks, I've discussed things that as placemakers, we can design to help create simpatico environments. Let's reassess some of these examples in a new light as physical attributes that support, encourage, incubate, or compel situated cognitions in dialogue with place. Nooks and crannies at the edges, obviously, from which to peer out, steps on which to lounge, stairs on which to perch, and seating, especially movable chairs, on which to rest. At the ground level, paving patterns that allow people to orient themselves and perceive specific precincts within the space. Facade design that references a human scale, and storefronts that are episodic, visually open, and convey identity, and I would argue, largely vertically composed. Water, both as an element of ambiance and as an element of active engagement. Water has always been important to man, so much so that many researchers won't show subject scenes containing water because their responses are so favorably biased it ruins the experiment. Water's presence in an urban public space has a natural and almost universal galvanic pull on its occupants. Elements that bring activity into the space and engage our senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. I've chosen to represent sight with public art, sound with musicians, although I could have used the Trevi Fountain or the waterfall in Paley Park as an example of sound, smell and taste with the presence of food, and touch with the ritual rubbing of the boar's nose in Florence. And that last example, ritual, brings me to the role of narrative. Our ability to create stories from form contributes to our sense of place. We can imagine what the stone feels like in the Signoria statues, even though we can't touch them. And we can understand what their allegorical stories are telling us about Florence's self-conception. We can imagine occupying a compelling roof terrace, even though we can't actually get there. We can imagine living in the cacophony of Naples' Spanish Quarter, even though we don't know anyone who does. And we can imagine a role for ourselves in a romance on Rome's Spanish steps. I'll come back to Don Linden's quote. It is not the designer who creates the sense of place. It is the user or observer. The designer merely sets out opportunities for others to use, to make distinctions, to perceive connections, and to take advantage, or not, of the structure of thought that is there. So our job is to set out opportunities, thoughtfully appropriate ones, and let the process of situated cognition build a sense of place. To sum up this 4-talk series, I would stress that successful urban placemaking relies on lots of characteristics, some large and general at the scale of urban design or the space planning party, and some small and specific at the scale of a storefront and sidewalk details. But the design of all of these characteristics should be based on their resonance with human beings, their ability to act as the armature for their situated cognitions, resting on the integration of form, activity, and meaning, our three-legged stool. If we are concerned about the nature of the public realm, we should create places that provide an information field that promotes emotional nourishment, and we should employ design strategies that follow a human-centered recipe that transforms space into place. This recipe is not magical or mysterious. It's actually well-researched and time-tested. It's now validated by brains research. You do not have to reinvent the wheel every time. It currently seems to be threatened by a preoccupation with computer design methodologies, resulting in self-referential building forms rather than buildings that relate to their context, and sustainable performance metrics, resulting in buildings enclosed in skins rather than in space-defining facades. Neither of these trends seems to care much about architecture's relationship to people or a building's relationship to place, and are trends that I'm trying to counterbalance in these talks. I'll conclude by stressing the importance of applying this recipe. As James Kunstler observed in his 1993 book, The Geography of Nowhere, quote, "The culture of good placemaking is a body of knowledge and acquired skills. If it is not transmitted from one generation to the next, it is lost," unquote. And Kent Bloomer and Charles Moore sum up the importance of the space between buildings itself when they write, quote, "The prime characteristic of a public place is public inhabitability, either in the full sense of people feeling naturally at home there, or at least in their being allies in its inhabitation. The great blank horrors of our public environment are the spaces that belong to no one, that are neither public nor private, neither comfortable nor inspiring, nor even safe, the no places that erode the public realm."